Welcome to Teacher Training Unplugged Radio. I'm Anthony Gorhan. Well, the last week has flown by, at least for me, and I hope it's been interesting and useful for all of you. Guy and I have noticed one or two things over the course of this week that interested us, that I thought you might be interested in hearing about. And I'd also like to spend a little time going over once again some of the ideas that have emerged over the last week, and to express my thoughts on why they're important, and to thereby maybe prompt a further discussion next week with you all. Towards the end of this podcast, I'd also like to share one or two tips for teaching practice and work management. So, with all of that in mind, let's get started. Guy and I talk quite a lot about what we see during input, during teaching practice throughout the day on courses like this. And one of the things that he mentioned on Friday, which stuck with me, was how excited he was to watch you all running into problems during teaching or during planning, and noticing these problems and working out for yourselves, with the help of your colleagues and occasionally with Guy's prompting as well, mainly through questions, finding solutions for these problems that you think might work, and then going away and experimenting with them in your subsequent lessons, or your colleagues trying it out in their lessons. And this approach to teacher training or teacher education, which we might call problem-solving driven, is something I personally think is very valuable. Now, why do I think this? There are a couple of reasons. One, it's more time efficient. Everything I seem to justify on the grounds of time efficiency, but I think it's true. You all came with various levels of knowledge about teaching, experience of teaching, experience and knowledge of language, and so on. And Guy and I might have wasted a mighty amount of your time by telling you things that you might already know or could already work out yourselves. Now, the second reason I think it's worthwhile adopting a problem-solving approach to teacher training, such as we've done this week, is that it respects your intelligence. I think this is a very important point. I don't want to presume ever that you can't work out a solution for yourself given the opportunity. I trust, it's one of my basic assumptions, that you are all fully capable of doing this, and therefore I expect it. I try not to get in the way of that process, and by asking the right questions or providing the right kind of opposition to initial ideas you might have, my aim is not to force you to think in the way that I think or the way that Guy thinks, but to force you to think more richly and deeply in the way that you think. Because what you think is far less important than how you think. What you think about teaching is far less important than how you think about teaching. What you think you know about language is far less important than how you think about language. And so, with that in mind, we're going to continue for the next 2 or 3 weeks, prompting you and provoking you in all ways possible to think about what's going on in front of you, when you're teaching or when your colleagues are teaching, so that we can extract from there the best possible lessons at the point at which they're most salient for you, which is the point at which you're encountering them. We've covered a lot of ground in the last week or so in terms of concepts and ideas about teaching. And some of them by now we've repeated or revisited so often that you might be getting the impression that they are matters of dogma. And I don't want to give you that impression. I think it's very important that we all understand that when Guy and I strongly suggest you do something, this is always provisional and always principled. It's provisional in the sense that it matters when and what specific example we're talking about, and it's principled in the sense that we want you to understand why, in any given case, it's a good idea to consider doing what we suggest, or what your colleagues have suggested. So with that in mind, I thought I'd visit 2 or 3 of the more common things that get revisited on courses like this, and that we've certainly talked about, and to try to uncover the provisions and the principles upon which these rest as good ideas. Now the first one, the most obvious one, is perhaps teacher talk. It might mean the amount a teacher says at any given time or throughout the whole lesson. It might refer to the speed at which they speak. It may refer to the complexity of the language they choose, or it may refer to any combination of those. The most important thing that you need to speak to your learners in a way that they can understand and make use of. This is not to say that you should reduce your language to some form of pidgin, but it is to say that if you can get away with being simpler or slower or less complex, then you should. Now, instructions are the classic moment where this really becomes important. And some people might say that this is a question or a function of learner level. The higher the level of learner, the less need there is to grade or control your teacher talk. Now this is true to an extent, but only to an extent. And my personal view is that even at the very highest levels, if you can get away with using imperatives, do this, do this, do this, and you can get away with using the simplest of language, then you should do so in those moments. Why? Because instructions are not linguistic input in the primary sense. They're not there to provide comprehensible data for your learners to build their language from. There are much better ways of doing that in a lesson, and moments to choose for doing that in a lesson, than when giving instructions. For example, during basic conversation with students, chatting to them, or when doing a targeted live listening activity, or when modelling and drilling language, or when providing new language on the board and discussing how it's formed. Now, as well as teacher talk, another thing that we've spoken a lot about is task before text. This old dichotomy, which way is best. And Guy and I have both said, give a task before you give out a text. Now, to expand that, what we really mean is, don't ask students to read something or listen to something before they are clear about why you want them to do it, which is to say, what the task is. It occasionally happens that teachers hand out an article and say, okay, I'd just like you to read this. And then several minutes go by as the students read the article. And at the end, the teacher starts asking them some questions. which the students can't answer very readily, at least not without going back and rereading sections of the text. The teacher might say, this is a good thing because the students end up rereading the article and finding the answers and so on. But it appears to me that it's just a massive waste of time. If the teacher had done what is more like a normal thing in the real world, which is make it clear to the students what they want to find out of the article, and then give them a moment to read it, the students would more readily find the information, be more confident in their approach to the text, and be able to give the teacher the answers that they're hoping for much more quickly, thus saving time, and thus enabling the teacher to do more and more interesting things in the time available. The same goes for listening tasks. It's a waste of time, I would suggest, playing a recording simply for the students to tune their ears. This is often an argument. Listen to it one time and just get used to how the voices sound. I would argue that students can very well get used to how the voices sound while doing something focused as well. Now, that something need not be particularly demanding. In fact, it should probably be quite straightforward. But in giving them something to focus on, it gives them a yardstick for how well they are attuning to the voices that they're hearing. So you get two things for the price of one. Okay, so the last thing I'd like to talk about is work management, workload management particularly. This weekend you had a number of things to work on. You all have your third lesson, which you're teaching on Monday or Tuesday. You all have the focus on the learner assignment, which is due Monday or Tuesday according to the strict deadlines, or Tuesday and Wednesday if you decide to push it back. And you also have, on the more distant horizon, your fourth lesson. So there are several things you need to be doing, and I just want to recap these. You need to plan for Monday if you're teaching, and produce a formal lesson plan. You may not be satisfied with the level of detail by the time you hand it in on Monday, but this is a training course. We'll give you feedback and you can build on that as you go along. Remember, it's your first attempt. Now, regarding the focus on the learner assignment, you have the chance to resubmit this assignment if need be, but it's best if you don't. Why? Because it's time efficient. So, let's just look at how you can do that. When you hand in your focus on the learner assignment, make sure that you have included information in every section. Make sure that your language analysis, the error analysis section, is complete and you have 3 examples analyzed in each section. Make sure that the language practice material that you choose to deal with a language problem the class has connects directly and explicitly to something in your error analysis. By the same token, make sure that the skills material you choose connects directly and explicitly to what you've described, okay? That's to say, if you choose a reading text from a course book, for example, make sure that the theme is explicitly something that they are interested in, and ideally also make sure that the type of reading that it's practicing, be that reading quickly for gist or reading more detail and so on, is something that you've said they need to get better at. Well, that's everything I'd like to say. If you found the time to listen to this, congratulations. So this is Anthony Gorton signing off. Looking forward to seeing you all again bright and breezy on Monday, and all the best for week 2. Bye now.